Standing before the elite of the Garden Festival Gala, Erin Caldwell watched in paralyzed horror as her phone screen went black, her final piece of evidence erased by her own husband's hand. Around her, the murmurs of the crowd turned into a deafening wall of pity and judgment, while security guards closed in, their hands already reaching for her bruised arms. Behind them, Margaret stood on the illuminated stage, a serene smile on her face as she prepared to announce Erin's voluntary commitment to a psychiatric ward. Just hours earlier, Erin had been fighting for her life in the dark, her lungs burning as she was shoved beneath the frigid water of the stone fountain. She still felt the jagged edge of the floral pick she had used to disable her attacker, and her hands were stained not with soil, but with the evidence of a desperate struggle. As the guards tightened their grip to drag her toward the waiting ambulance, Erin realized the terrifying truth. The woman who had stolen her business and forged her medical records wasn't just after the shop. She was burying a secret much darker than a real estate scam. The only question left was how many people were in on the lie. The stems snapped under her fingers like dry twigs, petals scattering across the work table in a confetti of failure. Erin's breath came in shallow bursts, the scent of crushed roses and damp earth clinging to her skin. The espresso had long since turned to acid in her stomach, but she reached for the cold dregs anyway, the bitter aftertaste grounding her. One more. Just one more perfect arrangement. She reached for a spray of eucalyptus, her knuckles permanently stained with soil and dye, moving with the frantic, precise rhythm of a conductor whose orchestra was playing on a sinking ship. The clock on the wall of Caldwell's blooms ticked with a predatory cadence, mocking the 3 empty mugs of coffee lined up on the counter. Her dark auburn hair was half escaping its messy bun, strands sticking to her neck, but she didn't have a second to brush them away. This installation for the Garden Festival was supposed to be her salvation, the bridge that would carry her business across the chasm of debt that had opened beneath her feet over the last 6 months. Her fingers bled where a thorn had found the soft meat of her thumb, but she barely noticed the sting. She was vibratory, wired on a cocktail of caffeine and adrenaline that made the very air in the shop feel thick. The massive installation, a towering structure of orchids, peonies, and weeping willow, loomed over her like a judge. Every 3 minutes, she checked the time, her eyes, a sharp, unnatural green, darting to the door. She was fighting for every second, wrestling with wire and floral tape, her mind a blur of logistics and desperation. The shop was a chaotic mess of wilted petals, discarded stems, and a stack of unpaid invoices that she'd shoved under a ceramic pot just to get them out of her sight. She felt like she was running a race with no finish line, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped thing, while the scent of the blooms, once a comfort, now felt like the heavy, cloying perfume of a funeral. The doorbell chimed. Too cheerful, too bright, before the weight of Margaret's presence pressed into the shop like a storm front. The air shifted, thickened. Erin didn't turn. She knew that silence, the way it stretched like a wire about to snap. Margaret stood there in an icy blue tailored blazer, her silver hair pulled into a chignon so tight it looked painful. She didn't move. She simply loomed, her pale, watery blue eyes surveying the wreckage of the workshop with a clinical disdain. "You call this quality?" Margaret's voice cut through the hum of the refrigeration unit, sharp as the shears Erin had just dropped. A manicured finger jabbed at the half-finished centerpiece, the peonies wilting under the scrutiny. The stems are uneven, the greenery's clumped. And this. A nail tapped the ribbon, the sound like a metronome counting down to disaster. Is crooked. She stepped deeper into the shop, her heels clicking against the tile like a judge's gavel. And the invoices, Erin. The suppliers are calling me now. They want their money. You've let the Caldwell name drag through the mud while you play with weeds. Erin's hands stilled, the thorns of the roses leaving tiny crescents in her palms. She swallowed the lump of pride in her throat, her voice dropping to that near whisper she used when the world became too much. It's not done, Margaret. And the invoices are being handled. Handled? Margaret let out a short, sharp laugh that didn't reach her eyes. The bank doesn't think so. I had tea yesterday with Harold Vance. You remember him? On the board of First National? He mentioned they're questioning your recent loan application. Apparently, there are concerns about the long-term viability of this hobby. The words landed like a punch to the sternum. Erin's vision blurred at the edges, the vibrant blooms around her suddenly too bright. A board member? Margaret had been whispering in ears, poisoning the well before Erin could even draw water. The shop wasn't just a business. It was her father's legacy, the only thing she had left that hadn't been touched by the Caldwell family's cold, manicured hands. Now, Margaret was reaching for the throat of it. "You're interfering," Erin said, her voice shaking despite her efforts. "You're talking to the board to sabotage me." "I am protecting my family's interests," Margaret replied, her voice unnaturally soft, forcing Erin to lean in. "You're drowning, dear, and you're trying to take this shop down with you. It's a pity. Your father would have been so disappointed to see what you've done to his life's work. Well, now, that was the tripwire." Erin didn't crumble. Instead, a cold, hard clarity washed over her. She turned away from the half-finished arrangement and walked toward the counter, her movements deliberate. She didn't need Margaret's approval, and she certainly didn't need her protection. "I'm busy, Margaret," Erin said, her fingers plucking a thick ledger from the shelf behind the register. She ignored the way Margaret's eyes narrowed at the sight of the book. "I have 3 custom orders to finish before the gala, and I'm not going to waste another second listening to your rehearsed speeches." She sat down on the high stool and opened the ledger, the paper yellowed and smelling of old ink. She began to audit the last 3 months of receipts, her pen scratching against the page with a defiant rhythm. She wasn't just looking for stability. She was looking for a way out. She knew every cent that came in and went out of this shop, and if there was a discrepancy, she would find it. Margaret stood by the display case, her body rigid, her smile frozen in place. She wasn't used to being ignored, especially not by someone she considered so beneath her. The silence in the shop grew heavy, broken only by the scratching of Erin's pen and the hum of the cooler. A battle of wills played out in the space between the roses and the ledger. Erin worked with a hyper-focused intensity, her mind split between the columns of numbers and the physical demands of the orders. She reached out with one hand to strip the leaves from a bunch of hydrangeas, while her other hand traced the line of expenses. It was a frantic dance of multitasking. A customer called, and she tucked the phone between her shoulder and ear, her voice brightening artificially as she promised a stunning anniversary bouquet, all while her eyes stayed locked on the ledger. She was proving a point, not just to Margaret, but to herself. She had hands. She would fix it. She was the one who kept the lights on, who knew which soil the orchids preferred, who spent her nights breathing in the scent of damp earth, while Margaret slept in her sterile Upper East Side penthouse. The shop was functional. It was profitable, or it would be, if the vultures would stop circling. Margaret watched her, the pale blue of her eyes tracking every movement, every flick of the wrist. The tension was a living thing, coiled in the air like a snake, waiting for the moment to strike. The bell chimed again, and David walked in. He looked like a man who had spent his life trying to be the good son. His dark curls a mess, his flannel shirt expensive but worn. He was carrying a steaming cup of Earl Grey, Margaret's favorite, and he didn't even look at Erin as he handed it to his mother. "Mom, I thought you might be here," David said, his voice warm, the kind of voice people trusted instantly. He finally glanced at Erin, but there was no support in his eyes, only a weary, practiced pity. "Erin, you look tired. Maybe you should take a break. Mom and I were talking about the festival, and we think it might be better if we brought in some extra help for the installation." "I don't need help, David," Erin said, her voice dropping to a low rumble. "I need you to stay out of my business." "It's not just your business, Erin. It's the family's," David countered, his voice steady but his hands beginning to crack his knuckles. One by one, a nervous habit that set Erin's teeth on edge. "We're just worried. You're working yourself into a state. Look at this place. It's a disaster." Erin felt the isolation like a physical weight. They were a wall, the two of them, a united front of concern that felt more like a cage. David wasn't seeing her. He was seeing the version of her Margaret had painted, the fragile, unstable wife who couldn't be trusted with her own life. He had aligned himself with the poison, and the betrayal tasted like the cold dregs of her espresso. "I want that ledger," Margaret said suddenly, her soft voice dropping any pretense of warmth. She reached across the counter, her long, bony fingers clawing for the book. "I want to see exactly how much of our money you've wasted." "It's my ledger, Margaret. Get your hands off it." Erin snapped, pulling the book toward her chest. The struggle was sudden and sharp. Margaret lunged, her manicured nails digging into the leather cover, her face twisting into something ugly and hungry. Erin held on, her knuckles whitening, her feet bracing against the floor. They were locked in a desperate tug of war, the ledger the only thing between them. David stood by, his face pale, his hands fluttering as if he wanted to intervene, but didn't know which side to take. "Give it to me," Margaret hissed, her strength surprising for a woman of her age. "No!" Erin shouted, her voice cracking. In the heat of the scuffle, they bumped against a heavy stone planter sitting on the edge of the display stand. It wobbled for a terrifying second before gravity took hold. The planter crashed to the floor with a sound like a gunshot, the heavy ceramic shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. The noise echoed through the narrow shop, a violent punctuation mark that sent both women reeling back. Soil and shards of stone sprayed across the hardwood, the dark earth staining the rug. For a moment, the only sound was the heavy, ragged breathing of the three people standing in the wreckage. The violence of the break seemed to freeze time, the destruction of the physical object a mirror to the shattering of the last remains of their civility. Erin gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. She looked down and saw a massive shard of the planter resting just inches from her toes. If she hadn't jumped back, her foot would have been crushed. The immediate physical danger cleared the fog of anger, replaced by a cold, sharp fear. She looked at Margaret, whose face was unnaturally still, her red-painted lips set in a thin line. Margaret wasn't shocked by the near injury. She was annoyed by the mess. "Look what you've done," Margaret whispered, her voice a venomous hiss. Erin didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on something else. In the chaos of the struggle, Margaret's designer purse had fallen to the floor, its contents spilling out onto the dirt-streaked tile. While Margaret was distracted, looking down at the broken planter and the mess on her shoes, and while David was hovering over his mother, asking if she was all right, Erin moved. It was a predator's instinct. She knelt as if to help clean up, and her fingers closed around a folded, heavy-stock document that had slid from Margaret's bag. She tucked it into the waistband of her apron in one fluid motion, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I'll clean it up," Erin said, her voice shaking but her hands steady. Just go. Both of you. Margaret straightened her blazer, her silver hair still perfectly in place despite the fight. She looked at Erin with a cold, watery stare. We're leaving. But don't think this is over, Erin. Not by a long shot. She turned on her heel, the click of her boots final as a judge's gavel. David followed her, casting one last, lingering look at Erin. A look of disappointment that hurt worse than the thorns. The door swung shut, the bell chiming one last, mocking note. Erin waited until the sound of their footsteps faded before she pulled the document from her apron. She retreated to the back workshop, the scent of crushed roses and damp earth heavy in the air. Her hands shook as she unfolded the paper. It was a legal notice, drafted by a high-end firm in Manhattan regarding the Garden Festival's land rights. She read the words once, then twice, her breath hitching. The charitable festival wasn't a celebration of nature, it was a smokescreen. The documents detailed a massive real estate buyout, a plan to redevelop the entire block into luxury condos. The festival was the final step to secure the permits for demolition. Her shop, Caldwell's Blooms, was right in the center of the redevelopment zone. Margaret wasn't trying to save the shop. She was clearing the path to tear it down. But the real blow came on the final page. Erin's vision blurred as she stared at the signature line. There, in the familiar, looping script she had seen on 1,000 birthday cards and grocery lists, was David's name. He had signed the preliminary consent forms. He had known. He had been working with his mother to destroy the only thing Erin loved, all while bringing her tea and telling her he was worried about her state. The betrayal was a physical thing, a cold blade between her ribs. She was alone, truly, utterly alone. She looked around her shop, the narrow brick walls, the shelves of vases, the flowers she had tended with such care. It was all a lie. She wasn't fighting to save a business. She was fighting a war that had been decided months ago in a wood-paneled office she had never seen. Well, now, she whispered to the empty room, her voice a ghost of itself. Her fingers traced the edge of the paper, the ink feeling like poison under her skin. She didn't cry. The time for crying had passed with the shattering of the planter. She had hands. She would fix it. But first, she had to survive the night. The morning light felt like an intrusion, a harsh glare that exposed every crack in the shop's facade. Erin hadn't slept. She had spent the night pacing the narrow aisles, the stolen document a lead weight in her pocket. She had to get the centerpieces to the gala. If she failed this delivery, she'd be in breach of contract, giving Margaret the legal leverage she needed to shutter the shop before the first bulldozer even arrived. She hauled the last of the towering arrangements, a delicate balance of white lilies and trailing ivy, toward the back alley where her van was parked. The air was cool and smelled of damp pavement and the city's early morning exhaust. She hit the remote unlock, the lights flashing, but when she reached the rear door, she stopped. The van was slumped, leaning at an unnatural angle. Erin knelt, her knees hitting the grid of the alleyway. All 4 tires had been slashed, the rubber gaping open in jagged, deliberate smiles. It wasn't a random act of vandalism. It was a surgical strike. No, she breathed, her forehead resting against the cold metal of the door. No, no, no. She looked at her watch. The delivery window opened in 2 hours. She could call a tow, but in this part of Brooklyn, on a festival morning, she'd be lucky to see a truck by noon. Her hands, already stained and scarred, balled into fists. She wasn't calling for help. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. She went back inside, grabbed the heavy industrial jack and the spare from the storage closet, and dragged them into the alley. She had never changed a tire in her life, let alone 4. But she had a fuse box and a wrench and a stubbornness that bordered on the pathological. The work was brutal. The jack groaned under the weight of the van, and the lug nuts were rusted tight, requiring every ounce of her 5'3" frame to budge. Black grease smeared across her cheeks, her oversized sweater catching on the undercarriage. But she didn't stop. She grunted with the effort, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the ticking of the clock a physical pulse in her ears. She was a woman possessed, a grease-stained specter in the shadows of the alley, fighting a machine that seemed determined to fail her. While Erin was wrestling with a lug nut, miles away in a midtown restaurant that smelled of truffle oil and expensive perfume, Margaret was holding court. She sat at a central table, a vase of white lilies, her signature, casting long shadows over the white linen. The emergency committee lunch was in full swing, attended by the town's elite and the festival's most influential donors. "It's just so tragic," Margaret said, her voice a masterclass in controlled sorrow. She touched her pearl necklace, twisting the strand between her fingers. Erin has always been high-strung, but lately the stress of the shop, the debt. She had a violent breakdown yesterday, right in front of David. She started smashing things, her father's old planters, the very history of the place. A murmur of pity rippled through the table. Mrs. Henderson, the retired school teacher, leaned in, her eyes wide. A breakdown? But she always seemed so capable. The mind is a fragile thing, dear. Margaret sighed, sipping her tea. She's become paranoid, accusing David and me of the most absurd things. We're doing our best to manage the floral contracts for the gala. But I fear the poor girl is simply no longer fit to be in a professional environment. It's for her own protection, really. She smiled, a thin, icy expression that never reached her eyes. She was planting the seeds of instability, watering them with false concern, making sure that when the time came to remove Erin, the community would see it as an act of mercy rather than a theft. Back in the alley, Erin finally tightened the last nut on the 3rd tire. Her hands were raw, her fingernails blackened with grime, but the van was level again. She didn't have a 4th spare, so she'd had to use a can of Fix-A-Flat and a prayer on the last one. She climbed into the driver's seat, her heart hammering, and turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life. She drove with a manic focus, weaving through the Brooklyn traffic, the scent of the lilies in the back a constant reminder of the stakes. She made the delivery with 3 minutes to spare, her appearance so disheveled that the loading dock manager barely recognized her. She didn't care. She had won this round. But when she returned to the shop, the victory felt hollow. She reached into her bag for her keys, her fingers brushing against the fabric of her purse, but they weren't there. She emptied the bag onto the counter, receipts, lip balm, the stolen document. But the brass ring was gone. Panic, sharp and cold, seized her. She searched the workshop, the office upstairs, even the trash bins. Had she dropped them in the alley? Had they fallen out during the tire change? She felt the walls of her own sanctuary closing in. If she lost the keys, she lost the shop. She felt the paranoia Margaret had whispered about starting to take root. A nagging voice in the back of her head, asking if she was finally, truly losing her mind. She walked to the break room to splash cold water on her face, her eyes catching a glint of metal through the glass door of the industrial refrigerator. There, sitting on the middle shelf next to a carton of milk, were her keys. She stared at them, her breath hitching. She hadn't put them there. She never put them there. The cold from the fridge seemed to seep out and wrap around her throat. It was a gaslighting tactic, a psychological needle meant to prick her until she bled doubt. Margaret, or one of her shadows, had been inside. The sanctity of her space had been breached. She grabbed the keys, the metal freezing against her palm, and retreated to her apartment above the shop. She needed sleep, but sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. At midnight, a sharp, insistent rapping at the front door jerked her upright. She grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the bedside table and crept to the window. A delivery van, not hers, was idling at the curb. A man in a dark uniform was walking back to the vehicle, leaving something on her doorstep. Erin waited until the van pulled away before she ventured out. The night air was biting, the street silent. There, propped against the brick, was a massive funeral wreath. White carnations, lilies, and dark, waxy leaves. She leaned in, her eyes widening. Tucked into the greenery was a silk ribbon, the gold lettering shimmering in the streetlight. Erin Caldwell. Rest in peace. The threat was no longer subtle. It was a declaration of war. The next morning, the war arrived in the form of a man who looked like he had been punched one too many times. He wore a black polo shirt with a fake security logo, his massive frame filling the doorway of the shop. "Can I help you?" Erin asked, her voice dropping to that low, dangerous whisper. Her hand slid under the counter, her fingers finding the handle of the industrial stapler. Margaret Caldwell authorized a wellness check and a temporary eviction for the safety of the premises. The man rumbled, his voice a low, gravelly sound. "She says you're unstable, lady. I'm here to make sure you leave quietly. This is my property. Get out," Erin said, her shoulders squared. The man didn't move. He took a step forward, his hand reaching for her arm. "Don't make this difficult." Erin didn't hesitate. She grabbed a bottle of floral preservative from the shelf, a concentrated, acidic solution meant to keep stems open, and sprayed it directly into the man's eyes. He roared, his hands flying to his face, and Erin lunged. She slammed the industrial stapler against his knuckles, the heavy metal crunching against bone, and then pushed him with every ounce of her strength. He stumbled back, blinded and howling, and she slammed the door, locking it and throwing the bolt. Her heart was a drum in her ears. She was shaking, but it wasn't fear. It was a cold, white-hot rage. She was done being the victim. She retreated to the upstairs office, her mind racing. She needed evidence. She needed something more than a stolen land document. She began to tear through the desk, looking for anything Margaret might have left behind. In the bottom drawer, hidden under a stack of old catalogs, she found a folder. Inside were psychiatric evaluation requests, all of them bearing her name. She flipped through the pages, her stomach turning. Margaret had been forging her signature for months, building a legal paper trail of episodes and paranoia. The reports were detailed, clinical, and utterly false. But the final page was the clincher. The doctor who had signed off on the preliminary diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia was Dr. Richard Holloway. Erin recognized the name. She had seen him in a family photo at the Caldwell penthouse. He was Margaret's first cousin. The entire system was rigged. The therapy sessions she'd been attending for stress hadn't been about healing. They had been about gathering ammunition. Every word she'd said had been twisted, every tear noted as evidence of instability. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window of the office. A woman with dark circles under her eyes, grease on her cheeks, and a mouth set in a line so tight it might never unclench. The community believed she was crazy. Her husband was working to demolish her life, and the law was being written by the woman who wanted her dead. "Well, now," Erin whispered, her fingers tracing the forged signature. "Let's see how you like the truth." The Garden Festival Gala was a sea of twinkling fairy lights and the clinking of crystal. A gilded stage where the elite of the city gathered to celebrate a lie. Erin stood at the edge of the darkened garden, her clothes damp from the evening mist, her heart a frantic thing in her chest. She had the recording. She had found it on an old shop laptop, a grainy digital file of Margaret in a backroom deal, handing a thick envelope of cash to the land surveyor. It was the smoking gun. The proof that the entire festival was a criminal conspiracy. She just had to get to the stage. But as she moved toward the ballroom, a shadow detached itself from the oak trees. It was the gardener, a man who had spent his life in Margaret's debt, his hands gnarled and his eyes a startling, unnatural blue. He held a heavy iron spade, the metal glinting in the moonlight. "You shouldn't be here, Miss Erin," he said, his voice gruff, sparse. "Margaret said you were sick, said you needed to stay home." "I'm not sick, Arthur, and you know what she's doing," Erin said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her legs. "I know I owe her," the gardener replied, taking a step forward. "And I know she wants you stopped." He lunged, the spade swinging in a wide, lethal arc. Erin ducked, the metal whistling over her head, and scrambled toward the stone fountain at the center of the garden. The gardener was fast for a man of his age, his movements quiet and deliberate. He pinned her against the masonry of the fountain, the heavy spade pressing against her throat. "Don't make me do this," he whispered. But his weight was crushing her, the cold water of the fountain splashing against her back. He shoved, and Erin's world went upside down. She hit the water, the shock of the cold stealing her breath. Before she could surface, a heavy hand pressed down on the back of her head, forcing her back under. The water was dark, silent, and tasted of stone and old rain. Her lungs burned, a searing heat that radiated through her chest. She thrashed, her fingers clawing at the gardener's wrists. But he was a statue, a man carved from the land itself. The surface of the water was a shimmering, unreachable ceiling. "If I stop fighting, I'll disappear." The thought was a spark in the darkness. She reached into the pocket of her damp cardigan, her fingers closing around a sharp, metal floral pick she'd forgotten she was carrying. With a final, desperate surge of strength, she slammed the pick into the gardener's forearm. He let out a sharp cry, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. Erin surged upward, gasping for air, her vision swimming. She scrambled out of the fountain, her clothes heavy and dripping, and didn't look back. She ran toward the ballroom, the sound of the music growing louder, a beacon in the dark. She burst through the ornate doors, a bedraggled, shivering specter in the middle of the glittering crowd. The music stopped. The laughter died. Heads turned, eyes widening in horror and pity. "Listen to me!" Erin shouted, her voice raspy, her lungs still burning. She held her phone aloft, her thumb hovering over the play button. "I have the proof. Margaret Caldwell is a fraud. The festival is a scam to steal the land." Margaret stood on the stage, her silver hair shimmering under the chandeliers. She didn't look panicked. She looked sad. She looked at the crowd with a maternal, heartbreaking disappointment. "Oh, Erin," Margaret sighed into the microphone. "Look at you. You're shivering. You're confused. David, please help her." David stepped forward from the crowd, his face pale, his eyes filled with a terrifying, misguided love. "Erin, it's okay. We're going to get you help. I've already taken care of the things that were upsetting you. I cleared your phone, honey. All those stressful apps, those recordings you were obsessed with, they're gone. You can rest now." Erin looked down at her phone. The screen was blank. The recording, the bribery, the cash, the truth was gone. David had wiped it remotely, thinking he was protecting her from her own delusions. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing Erin had ever felt. She stood before the elite of the city, drenched and defeated, while Margaret took the stage to announce her voluntary retirement and immediate medical leave. "We've arranged for a private facility," Margaret said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "where Erin can get the care she so desperately needs. It's a tragedy, truly, but the Caldwells take care of their own." Security guards, real ones this time, in crisp uniforms, surrounded her. They took her arms, their grip firm but professional. Erin didn't scream. She didn't fight. She looked at David, who was watching her with a look of profound relief, as if he had finally saved her from herself. "You're killing it, David," she whispered as they led her away. "You're killing everything." The guards dragged her toward the service exit, the path leading past the industrial trash chutes and the dumpsters. Margaret followed, her heels clicking a triumphant rhythm on the concrete. "Wait," Margaret said, signaling the guards to stop. She stepped close to Erin, the scent of expensive perfume and lemon polish overwhelming the smell of the damp earth. "Let's be practical, dear. You've lost. The community sees you as a madwoman. Your husband thinks you're a child. But I'm a generous woman. I'll buy the shop. A pittance, really. But enough to pay off your debts and keep you in that lovely facility for a long, long time. Sign the contract, and this all goes away." She held out a pen and a pre-signed sales agreement. The city council members were standing nearby, watching the charitable act with nodding approval. Erin looked at the contract, then at the ballroom behind her. Her eyes snagged on the towering centerpieces she had delivered that morning. They were beautiful, speckled lilies with deep orange-red petals and dark spots. Lilium tigrinum monstrosa, a cold, sharp clarity washed over her. She knew those flowers. She had been forced to order them under Margaret's tax ID because no reputable nursery would carry them. They were a prohibited invasive species, a carrier of a virus that could devastate the local ecosystem. The federal fines for using them in a public park were astronomical, and the environmental permits for any development on land where they were planted would be nullified for a decade. "Well, now," Erin said, her voice steadying. She looked at the council members, her green eyes sharp as glass. "You might want to check those lilies, gentlemen. Margaret insisted on them, but they're illegal. Lilium tigrinum monstrosa. Under federal law, this entire festival site is now a contaminated zone. Your real estate permits? They're worth less than the paper this contract is printed on." The council members exchanged panicked looks. The land surveyor, who had been hovering near Margaret, went ashen. "What is she talking about?" one of the councilmen demanded. "She's lying," Margaret hissed, her composure finally cracking. "She's a lunatic." "I'm a florist," Erin countered, her voice ringing out through the service area. "And I kept the invoices." Invoices Margaret signed using her own tax ID to bypass the nursery restrictions. She wanted the rare look for the gala, but she didn't realize she was signing her own indictment. Erin didn't stop there. She looked at Margaret, whose face was beginning to sag, the mask of perfection melting. "And I didn't need the phone, Margaret. I'm not as unstable as you'd like everyone to believe. I mailed physical copies of the land scam documents, the ones with David's forged consent and your bribery notes, to the local newspaper's editorial office at 8 a.m. this morning. They should be going to press right about now." The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret let out a sound, a low, animalistic growl, and her professional facade vanished. "You little bitch!" she screamed, her voice cracking. I built this. I did what I had to do. The family trust was empty. David's father left us with nothing but debts and a name. I needed that buyout. I deserved it. The guests in the ballroom, who had drifted toward the service exit to watch the drama, gasped. Margaret had just confessed to embezzlement and fraud in front of a dozen witnesses, and the very city officials she had tried to bribe. She lunged at Erin, her bony fingers reaching for her throat, her face a mask of primal rage. But before she could touch her, a hand caught her wrist. David stepped between them. He didn't look like a good son anymore. He looked like a man who had finally seen the monster in the room. He held his mother back, his face set in a line of grim determination. "Enough, Mom," David said, his voice a low rumble. "It's over." The police arrived minutes later, the blue and red lights reflecting off the crystal chandeliers of the ballroom. They led Margaret away in handcuffs, her silver hair finally coming undone, her screams of rage echoing through the park. David turned to Erin, his eyes filled with a profound, shattering regret. "Erin, I didn't know. I thought I was helping. I know what you thought, David," Erin said, her voice softening. "But you weren't listening. You were just there." 6 months later, the air was different. It didn't smell of perfume or exhaust. It smelled of fresh rain and growing things. Erin stood in a modest greenhouse, her hands still stained, still scarred, moving with a gentle, unhurried rhythm as she trimmed a spray of jasmine. The shop in Brooklyn was gone, sold to a local cooperative that would keep it a greenery, but the debt was cleared. She and David had moved away, found a small piece of land where the silence wasn't a weapon, but a gift. David was on the porch, watching her. He was still a man in progress, still learning how to be the person he was rather than the person he was told to be. But they were building something. Not a legacy, not an empire, but a life. Erin knelt in the soil, the damp earth cool against her skin. She didn't have to fight anymore. She didn't have to disappear. She was just there. And for the first time in a very long time, that was enough.